direction of the discourse and the issues that the discourse focuses on is primarily representative of the interests of the global north. Second, we live in a world where the transnational movement of goods and services is seen as a virtue. Yet, it's a world which typically, in most parts, outlaws the producers of these goods and the providers of these services from crossing borders. In other words, borders seem to be only for people, not for goods or services. What has been the consequence of this? The consequence of this has been that you have a rule-based supranational body to govern goods and services, which is the WTO, but you have nothing of the kind for dealing with transnational problems arising from migration or the problems of asylum seeking or refugees. Finally, you should also remember that if you look at the discourse in the global north, most see migration as a problem rather than an opportunity. Now, does India have a migration policy? Short answer, no. It doesn't have a migration policy. So far, since 1947, we've responded to circumstances or challenges that migration-related issues have thrown up. But you can discern a policy based on the legal instruments that are in place, which I'll come to shortly. There are, first, because we're going to be discussing the dichotomy between sovereignty and rights and the problem of refugees, let's first look at the world of migration, international migration. There are three dimensions to it. First is the humanitarian dimension, which really means you're looking at refugees. And refugees in international migration constitute the largest percentage of the population, okay, that is on the move or that is crossing borders. The second is the development dimension, which is you're talking about economic migrants, who are, whether they're high-skilled, low-skilled, labor mobility, but they are economic migrants. And the third is the human rights dimension, which is the asylum seekers, right? Now, humanitarian or refugee-related issues are arising from a slew of problems. It could be conflict, it could be climate change. Dr. Venkatrao alluded to some of them in his opening remarks. Development, clearly it is the demographic transition that most countries are going through, as a result of which everybody is talking about a demographic dividend in some parts of the world and deficits in other parts of the world. And human rights, of course, asylum seekers, which is based on, since tomorrow is going to be the commemoration of the Human Rights Convention, I'll also come to that. So what did the international framework or the UN Declaration of Human Rights 1948 do? First of all, it introduced Article 13, which in Article 13.2 said that every person has a right to leave a country, his own or her own, and to return to that country. So essentially, it gave the right to emigrate or to leave. But there is no corresponding right in the charter, in the Human Rights Charter, to enable somebody to enter another country. That was left to the sovereign domain of nation states. Okay? And in my view, without the right to immigration, the right to emigrate is just a theoretical construct. It is an idea. And you have left the authority, the power to refuse entry to the sovereign nation state. This is important because this will recur, you will see, in different parts of the discourse. And it was therefore not without reason. I don't know how many of you know, but I believe that the UN Charter on Human Rights and the entire Bretton Woods institutions were indeed established to maintain the balance of power with the allies. And Dr. Venkatrao spoke about it, saying that it was more a maintenance thing. So it's a convenient arrangement. So if an American is head of the World Bank, a European has to be head of the IMF. You have the United Nations General Assembly, where there is nominal political equality, but you have the Security Council, which is the de facto body which makes the decisions, right? So it was not without reason that Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first chairperson of the International Commission on Human Rights, said that the time that the charter was put to vote, the entire Soviet bloc, well, most of the Soviet bloc, abstained from voting in support of the charter. And why did they do so? She said it was directly related to Article 13.2. Now, what is the origin of Article 13.2? Essentially, it was to enable dissenters from the Soviet Union to be brought out into the so-called free world. Now, that discourse has continued. In a way, it is seeking to dominate the global south. Why I'm emphasizing this is that, as Dr. Venkatrao said, I too believe that moving forward, this is going to be the Asian century. And all of you have an exceptionally important role to play. Each of you must become an expert in immigration, emigration, refugee, and asylum law. Because moving forward, you're going to be facing a large number of issues which are not at the transactional level. And that was another point on which I would critique the concept note, that you've looked at it very transactionally when you should actually be looking at the global picture. So Article 13.2 then, therefore, because there is no right to immigration, segues very nicely into Article 14 of the Human Rights Declaration, which is everybody has the right to seek and to enjoy asylum. So you have put it back into the lap of the sovereign state to decide whether they will give asylum to somebody or not, whether they will accept refugees or not. So this fundamental dichotomy between sovereignty and human rights is built into the charter. And it is my view that this is not by default. This was by design. Now we come to the let's fast forward to the Global Compact on Migration. So what does the Global Compact on Migration say? First of all, it's a unifying framework of common principles. It is non-binding. And remember, anything which is non-binding simply translates into allowing sovereign states to take a view whether they are going to accept it or not. Secondly, its objectives focus on some very key issues. One is, it says countries must try and minimize the drivers that compel people to leave, which means you see migration as a problem, so try as far as possible to prevent people from leaving their countries. Second, ensure that there is proof of identity and proper documentation. Again, focusing on, you can't enter my country if you don't have proper documents. That's a good view, but all I'm saying is there is this bias built into how the GCM document has been drafted. And let me just digress for a moment. A country like India, a country like China, which are going to be clearly the drivers of economic growth moving forward, punch well below their weight in the international discourse. We are nowhere present, neither the lawyers, nor the civil servants, nor the political leaders, right? And that has to change fundamentally. And why does that need to change? Because you're beginning to see that the transatlantic alliance is under strain, severe strain. The Bretton Woods institutions are in decline. You can see that the WTO is on the verge of closure if the United States doesn't nominate or approve who's going to be the judicial representative on the WTO. And therefore, the balance of power is beginning to shift to the global south. But are we ready to sit at the high table? It's not really a question of whether India is capable, or India, from an ethical perspective, has the moral right to be on the Security Council or not. Did any of the ones who already are there, do you think that they have a sterling record of human rights, including the United States? Not quite. So we must prepare ourselves to be at the high table. Now, the primary concern of the GCM is to strengthen the international response to the smuggling and trafficking of migrants. So how do you do it? You primarily do it through the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Crime and the UNODC. Okay? Now, a key element, now I come to India. So how does India deal with all of these problems? The broad framework, as I said, we don't have a stated policy. The broad framework is out-migration is governed by the Emigration Act, 1983, right? And this arose from a very important judgment called Kanga versus Union of India, 1979, Supreme Court, which laid down the guidelines of which then became the basis for the Emigration Act, right? So the Emigration Act structure is very simple. It says no Indian citizen can leave the country for emigrate, and emigration is defined as going out for more than a year for work without prior approval of the government. Second, that nobody shall recruit an Indian citizen for overseas employment without being registered with an appropriate authority of the government of India. And third, that there shall be a Protector General of Emigrants who will give the permission for a citizen to go abroad and also register the recruiters. The second act is the Foreigners Act, which essentially rests on Section 3, which is the power to make orders, right? It's a very powerful act. And a lot of people, I'm sure, and first of all, I think the structure of this day's workshop is outstanding. I must congratulate the organizers. So you have a broad, big picture first session, then you focus more on specifics in the second section, and then you get to the micro details of the NCR and all that in the third session. So the Foreigners Act, you might think, is a regressive act. I'm sure many of my co-panelists will say that the modalities or the how it is implemented runs counter to human rights. And I would only say that you must go to some of the other countries and see how it is done and look at how India does it. Yes, I can quote several extreme outlier examples of how somebody was imprisoned without rights, etc., etc. But otherwise, it is a reasonably competent piece of legislation which enables the state to manage in migration. The third is the Illegal Migrants Constitution of Tribunals Act of 1983. Now, when it comes to India's position on asylum seekers and refugees, the problem is not in the subcontinent. Okay? We have porous borders, right? And India, you must say very proudly, recognize very proudly, has been a country which has provided succor to a very large number of refugees. We had the refugees which came in during partition. We had the refugees coming in from Tibet. We've had Afghans. Justice Rajendra Babu actually referred to some of those issues, the Chakmas. We've had Sri Lankan Tamils coming, and so on and so forth. And all of them have been provided with succor. The only time that we have departed from, though we are not signatories to the Refugee Convention of 1951, I think historically we should be proud of our track record that we have always followed the principle of non-refoulement. Okay? The first time that we made a departure was in the affidavit filed in 2017 in the Rohingyas case, where we said that, you know, this is only for those who are signatories, only if it's not coded, there is no national legislation which governs this, and therefore, etc., etc. But that's only now in an, it's an aberration if you ask me. But otherwise, we've always followed the principle as a country of non-refoulement. Now, the problem, as I said, is not with the subcontinent. We've had, we continue to have refugees, illegal migrants or irregular migrants, depending on how you want to describe them, coming in, all right? The problem really is of out-migrants to other countries who might be compelled to return and resettle in their countries of origin. Now, if you see, and I'll end with this, last two things that I want to say. if you look at Europe, most of EUMS member states, their discussion on migration, which is what is called the global agenda on migration and mobility, GAMM, and with India they have something called CAMM. I think Sita Sharma will be speaking a little more about this. Hinges on one fundamental thing, that if you talk migration with any EUMS or any with the EU, they will say you must sign a return and readmission agreement. And India has steadfastly said we will not sign a return and resettlement agreement. And why is that so? It is not so much India's case that we don't want to accept refugees who are coming from around our, from the subcontinent. I'll give you a few examples. See, return and resettlement, first of all, India has argued that ethnicity is not nationality. Okay? There can be a Pakistani who looks like me, speaks like me. There can be, a Bangladeshi who looks like me, speaks like me. So what happens is when illegal migrants or irregular migrants are caught in other countries and they are asked to be sent back, if they are asked, where are you from? And typically, as Justice Rajendra Babu pointed out, most of them are without documents. Even if they did have fake documents or genuine documents, most of them destroy them. Okay? So when they are apprehended at the border, it is typically they are paperless. So they are asked, where are you from? What do you think they're going to say? Will they say that I'm from Pakistan or Bangladesh? Most likely they'll say I'm from India. Now, so immediately now, what happens is that country, and you must remember this, that immigration, asylum seeking, refugees is not just a question of a relationship between an individual and the state. It is that, but it's more. It's also relationships between states and states, right? So that state now talks to us and says that, hey, listen, there are 97 people from your country, we are sending them back. 97? Where did they come from? Okay, there was a shipwreck in Mauritania, in the Spanish enclaves, and there were 106 people on board. The ship got wrecked, they were rescued, 97 of them claimed they're from India. Finally, how many were from India? 6. 91 were from various other countries. So return and resettlement for India becomes an issue not in the context of our neighborhood, but in the larger context of the globe.
I'm going to have to give you a
Yeah,
time
I'm ending with this.
Thank you.
The second is that we have a problem of being a major country of transit. So another example that I could give you is a ship arrived on the Australian coast, and it was carrying an Indian flag. It was registered in India. So all those the captain was asked, where did you board from? He said from Mumbai. So they were, some of them were found to be illegal or irregular without documents. And they said, you should go back to your country, and they said to India. But when the Indian government actually went into it, what was found was that at high sea, a boat carried some of these people and they boarded the ship. So there are many problems relating to this. Last point, what has been the judiciary's view on refugees and asylum seekers? I think the Indian judiciary has done a remarkable job. It's taken a very liberal view of irregular migrants and refugees, and it has tried to read into, despite the absence of India being, despite India not being a signatory to some of the important international conventions, it has tried to read the spirit of those conventions into Indian law and ensured that refugees and asylum seekers and irregular migrants have been given at least the protection of Article 14 and Article 21, the right to equality before law and the right to life and liberty. But in most of the judgments, I won't go into some of the cases, I'm sure the others will talk about specific cases, but most of the time, Supreme Court has stopped short of giving them rights under Article 19 or going beyond, even in the Chakma thing, which Justice Rajendra Babu spoke of. I'll stop here, and I would only say that, I think you should look at international migration in the global context, and therefore look at immigration and emigration in terms of what the challenges are going to be for the future for India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I think I became a bit engrossed in.
Of course, like the others, congratulate the organizers of this. I think it's very timely to have this conversation. Just to say, and thank you, Mr. Gurucharan, because, he's given you the broad overview and, told you where this is all situated in a global space. So I'm going to be actually very specific. And I'm going to come down to reflections that look at India a lot more. And I'm not a lawyer. I come from the International Labour Organization, so I'm also going to give you a labor angle to all of this, which fits in globally, but also of how India is looking at some of this, and perhaps why it's so important that some of you sitting here as lawyers need to also look at this issue in a certain way, perhaps. So I'm going to, I'll take off from where, Guru Charan said that, there are these conventions, there are these frameworks. True, and they've been there for several years. We've had, the International Convention for Migrant Workers now for 2 decades. And now the Global Compact is being developed as we speak. It's actually being endorsed as we speak. And the thing is that despite having all these conventions, despite having these frameworks, by the way, the Labour Organization also has had international conventions. We are a standard-setting organization, so we have had conventions for migrant workers, but nobody signs them. Nobody comes up to that mark. Nobody wants to agree to these things. And this is where, you start reflecting back and thinking, what's going on here? And then you look at India. Supposedly a very large player, but with a very small global voice in this issue. And then you suddenly see for a while that in the recent years, in the recent year, they have been taking a very, very strong stance on the blurring of regular and irregular migrants and the rights for them. Now, this is something that a lot of the global advocates have been pushing for, saying, well, workers become irregular, not by fault of theirs. There are many reasons. And so, people are very confused as to why India as a country of origin is taking such a strong stance on irregular migrants. After all, largely it is the destination countries that have this discourse. So there's been a lot of suddenly frantic calls, people asking, trying to understand, what is India, why is India doing this? And Indians, there are so many irregular Indians in the world. Why does it not want protection for its own people? And then you try to make sense and you try to understand what's going on here. And there may be two or three perhaps, large factors that I can put this under. And one of them, and notwithstanding what, Mr. Gurucharan said before, that, these are about sovereignty issues. How do we prove whether someone is Indian or not Indian? Sure. But there are 2 or 3 factors here that I'd like you all to register. One of them, of course, is very much that as a country, how can we go about saying we open doors and it's okay for irregular people to be in and out? It's like protecting your national boundaries. And this is not India doing this. This is every country in the world doing this, where they're taking a stronger stance because they believe that it helps protect their labor market for their nationals. I'll tell you how that works out, but that's what they believe. And then for India, I think it's also an image issue, frankly speaking. We like to have this image where we are a good migrant sending country, where we want to pursue regular migrants going, and that's a good stance to have. It's good that we want to see regular migrants going. But it's almost as if we want to try and keep that market, and we want to keep that image, and we want to protect it for ourselves. And so if we appear as a country that actually is promoting regular migration, taking a very strong stance under irregular migration, we are the ones who will actually gain in the long term from this. We may not, but that's how it's looked at. And then there may just be another third angle, which some of us which increasingly in my work I find quite disturbing. I meet a lot of irregular migrants who are Indian, and they are Indian. They do seek various recourses to be in other countries, and they are rejected by the Indian government very often. The Indian government does say that, how do we know you're Indians? We don't know, there's all this. And there is a similar thread somewhere along these people, and this is what captures my attention sometimes. They do belong to certain groups of India. They don't belong to you and me classes. The irregular migrants don't necessarily come from a certain class, a certain caste, a certain group. They come from minorities very often. You will have differences in the Gulf where large numbers become irregular for their own legal spaces, and those may be still more mixed. But the other Indians that you will find who are irregular in Europe, for example, some of them even finding their way, lots of them in the UK perhaps, come from certain minority groups. And I'd like you to just keep this thought because I'll try and come back to it later. But when you look at India having this posturing of we send regular migrants, we are very strongly against irregular migrants, what is the implication? What will India do? What will India do here? What will India do as a country? If you ask me, more borders, more detentions, more deportations. For me, this is what India is aiming to do. And as a someone who works with migrants, and I've been doing this for more than a decade now, actually almost 2 decades, I would say, you find that, is this going to prevent irregular migrants from coming in? This is the question I ask. Is this going to stop them? The answer is no. It isn't. This doesn't work like this. The global world doesn't work like this. And this is where also one has to understand, and what also Mr. Gurucharan was saying, while goods move and there's free movement, people don't have free movement. But it doesn't mean that the forces are not there for them to move. And so I'm going to try, I come from a labor organization. So I'm going to try and look at it from a labor perspective. Now this may be a little different from where you're coming from because you're lawyers probably, but just so that you understand it. And I'm going to try and simplify it so that you get where I'm coming from. So now you have, try to look at a country like India. We have a very large population. We actually have a lot of underemployment. Unemployment figures vary, but we have a fair amount of unemployment. And it kind of beats the logic. When you have so many people who need jobs, when you have so many youth who are unemployed, why is it that the jobs are going to the migrants? How come the migrants are filling these jobs? What's going on here? How come there are jobs that migrants can even take? And then you look, and then you have to understand that there are structural flaws. The labor markets and what is happening is operating in a certain way. And you see, and you see this around the world, but you see this very much happening in India. And what you see is, if you have more flexibility in the labor market, so we're introducing labor reforms, we just kind of have, where you allow for more outsourcing, where there's more flexibility, where there are lesser inspections, where you have labor markets which are opening up. Yes, and so they're trying to make it easier for companies to do manufacturing. But then you also have stratification of workers. The same rights are not given to migrants as they are given to other nationals. What will happen in this situation? What happens when this happens to a labor market? And this is happening around the world, mind you. What will happen? There's a race to the bottom. There is a race to get the cheapest labor. There is a race to undercut wages, to undercut working conditions. You can do all of this because the system is now allowing you to do this, and actually in a sense almost promoting that this can happen, so that there is more manufacturing, so that there is more work for people. But who can undercut? Who is the weakest chain in a labor market? It will be the migrant. It will always be the migrant who can undercut, who will work even lower than somebody who can work, who will go one step lower, whose working conditions can be even squeezed further. And this is for a few reasons. One, of course, that may be, and you can even just look at Bangladesh and India, for example, if the minimum wage is 80 there, you will earn more here. So yes, there is an income that a migrant can make. And so for them, even that little added value is good enough, it's full enough. But then they won't ask for their rights. They won't. So you can squeeze them more because they cannot. And so you will always find that there's somebody who's bringing the labor further down, and the migrants keep filling that. And then you wonder, well, is that, and then there's this rhetoric that, oh, the migrants come in, so we don't have the jobs. And it's very easy to blame it on them. It's almost, they're the scapegoats of where countries are failing, of where governments are failing. To actually say, well, you don't have a job because there are all these people coming in, and so we need to have an entire discourse that actually is based and targeting them, as if they are the ones who created this problem, as if they are the ones who actually came and took the jobs. And you have to, and then they become the target, and they become the scapegoats for these, for many powers, actually. And this is happening around the world. This is happening in Europe. This is happening in the US, that the migrant is targeted. Whereas actually, when you look at it, this is not a migrant problem. This is not also the problem of them coming and taking your jobs. And I'll give you an example, and it's an example that really stayed with me, because I thought, how can this happen? But there were, and this is of another country, but it's just so that you can understand what it does to a labor market.